Okay, Hosea. I first read this book, I think it was last year, and to be perfectly frank, it really didn't make that much of an impression on me. I was like, it's all right, but is it really relevant for today? But then when I was asked to relook at it, I was like, I've got to find something. And I missed an awful lot, is all I'll say. But I'll give you a bit of a background. So who was Hosea? He was a prophet who lived in the northern kingdom of Israel. He married Gomer, who's quite a significant lady in his life, and had 3 children. He was what they called a minor prophet for 40 years, and he was called to condemn fake worship, false gods, and social injustice, which is why I like him. His actual name, Hosea, is particularly quite key, as in translation it means salvation or help, and that's quite a key theme throughout this book, as in Hosea you get the depiction of how salvation is found through having a relationship with God. So I'll give you a quick summary of the whole book now, a very quick summary. It's a book that's about love, as the picture might suggest, and relationships. It's a story of one man's love for his unfaithful wife, Gomer, and through that narrative you get the story of God's love for his unfaithful people. Okay, so Hosea represents God, and Gomer represents the people of Israel, or you could say kind of represents us as well at times. So what did Hosea do? He was called to marry a woman he knew would be unfaithful. Now that in itself is an extraordinary act. This book doesn't tell you whether he married for love or not, but it does indicate that Hosea knew that when he married Gomer that she would struggle to be faithful to him. So Gomer is unfaithful to Hosea, but when she is, God calls Hosea to take her back, to love her again as a wife despite her unfaithfulness. Now, God asks of Hosea what I consider quite a heroic task, but it's a task that God does know really well. Hosea's troubles with his wife mirror God's troubles, but also God's love for the unfaithful people of Israel. It's a love that is held in a covenant, and it's one that cannot easily be lost or discarded by just one or even several bad acts. The way God feels towards the people of Israel can be further understood through the names given to the children of the unfaithful Gomer. I think this is PowerPoint coming up. Yeah. His children are named Jezeel, which translates as God scatters, Loruma, which means no more mercy, and Lo-Ami, not my people. Jezreel meaning God scatters, just refers back to the valley of Jezeel, where there was like a big warfare happening and lots of blood was shed. So it doesn't have the best connotations, really. But the second name, which means no mercy, has a lot more significance. I mean, up to that point in time, Ruama, which is the mercy part of the section of that name, had come almost to describe the nature of God. It was his character, because to Israel, God had just been endlessly mercy and full of compassion. So mercy was what they knew of God. It was God to them. And no mercy would have been a really confusing message from God to the Israelites. It would have been like, we don't know you at all. Who is this God now? So the Israelites had almost defined God in such a static way, and they hadn't considered how a relationship with God was meant to be a two-way process. It seems as though the people of Israel had never considered that by not being compassionate themselves and reciprocating the relationship with God, but instead disrupting and disrespecting that relationship through their actions, that it might affect how God was towards them as a whole nation. God, we know, is compassionate, yet a lack of faithful response to God does and it will change the relationship between God and another being, or in this case, a nation. In this context, the name No Mercy implies that God feels as though he's been patient long enough with Israel. He can no longer simply watch as the people worship other gods, use temple prostitutes, and act in an altogether ungodly manner. He feels that it's time they are made aware that their relationship is just not working, so that it can become in the future a stronger relationship. The last child name, which means not my people, I found really hard to read and comprehend at first. It just seemed too cruel. It seems that God has completely just washed his hands of them. He's just got no pride, ownership, or feeling of being connected with them. It just highlights how broken that relationship's become. But I stepped back and I considered the whole book. And I was like, well, maybe you're going to realize that God is wanting to make it clear via the relationship of Gomer and Hosea how he feels about the disrupted relationship between him and his people of Israel. This is a God who feels hurt, pushed away, and frankly abandoned by his people. Those are the same feelings which Hosea no doubt felt when Gomer betrayed him. God's reaction to Israel reminds me a bit of how when you're little and you do something that's kind of hurtful or embarrassing in public, I don't know if you've had this, but your sibling just goes, they're not with me, they're not part of me, and they're just not. And at that time, that moment, the hurt you've caused or the embarrassment is really real. It's a real emotion. But you know, and your sibling knows, that emotion isn't the stronger one. The stronger one is of love. And so you will forget that incident and you will forgive it. Here I see that in God's response to Israel. He still loved his people, but for now, God wants to be disassociated from their actions. Israel, at the time of Hosea, was a very wealthy nation, but their wealth had led to a lifestyle of decadence, of an attitude of just arrogance and self-reliance, which led to an abandonment of needing or following God. Instead, they turned to worship other gods and false idols. They indulged in temple prostitutes and ignored those in need. It's understandable when you get the whole background and the context why at the time God wants to just distance himself from Israel. You can probably move on in the PowerPoint. Yet one thing is clear when reading the book of Hosea is how much God didn't want to punish his people. He had actually told Israel to stop sleeping around and given plenty of warning to Israel to stop choosing the wrong gods, listening to the false prophets, and turn back to him. Yet when Israel continued to ignore God, he was literally left with no choice. He just had to punish them, just to help them in effect. Now, I know at the analogy I started with, placed God in the position of a husband and Israel in the position of a wife. Yeah, at times throughout Hosea, you get a feel that God is quite parent-like in how he responds emotionally to Israel's behaviour. As a kid, I was someone who was smacked by either my mum or my grandma, so two women in my lives. And I remember the phrase that was chucked at me just before I was about to be smacked was, "This will hurt me more than it will hurt you." Now, I didn't get that. I was like, that's not possible. You're going to hit me. But as an adult, I can imagine how much it would have hurt my mum or my grandma to have even hurt me a little bit. Yet they only ever did it when I was about to do something that was going to be extremely dangerous or I was going to get harmed or hurt, such as like running into a road, or I regularly attempted to stick my fingers in plug sockets and things like that. So first of all, I was given a warning. Then when I thought they were wrong or I just chose to ignore them, I'd get a smack. So as an adult, I was quite appreciative of that. But this parent-like feeling of being the one having to give out the punishment but hurting more through the process is one that I can see that's clearly shown in Hosea. So God hurts when he has to punish us. But unlike when I was a kid, and usually when you're a kid, I knew when I was being naughty, being bad. The people of Israel just seem so off track that they've become almost unaware that they aren't in true relationship with God, living the way God had planned for them, or making God proud of them. One example of this is how they would worship. They often brought sacrifices and just simply went through the motions. It was meaningless to them. It was just more ritualistic, done more for their consciousness than any need or desire for God or for God's presence in their lives. Hence God's cry in Hosea chapter 6, verse 6 of, "I don't want your sacrifices, I want you." True worship for God is built on so many things, but obedience to God is a key one. After all, it's the first commandment, and it's something that the Israelites had clearly forgotten when they began to worship other gods. But I think another important factor that had been lost was just the actual relationship